Hello everyone, my name is William, aka the Swedish Polyglot, and on this channel I talk about language learning, psychology and philosophy. In this particular video I will be covering a basic principle of metalearning, which is the idea that we always want to look for limitations in our own approach, in our own methods. And in my previous two videos, the first one I defined what is metalearning. I also talked about why we want to improve our metalearning. And in my previous video, I talked about how to approach learning anything, basically, and how you might want to start with those videos, but otherwise you can sort of listen to this video and see if you follow along. I think you might follow along anyways. So to begin, a very basic principle of metalearning in terms of improving your general method for how you're learning whatever it is you're trying to learn is to look for limitations, right? So in psychology, we talk about something called confirmation bias. So as humans, we're kind of wired to look for information that confirms our prior beliefs and hypotheses and so on. So we sort of want to be aware of this, and then we want to try to work against this. So we want to be looking for information that disconfirms or parts of our methods, or at least we want to look for gaps in our method. We want to be aware of where our method might be lacking in some area. So I will give you an example from my personal learning history as a language learner. So I will start from when I started learning my first language, right? My first language that I learned was Spanish. And if you're starting out in any sort of learning endeavor, your meta-learning abilities, your ability to learn or underlying understanding of the learning process is probably going to be limited. That's because you lack experience, right? And so that was the case for me, right? So my method for learning Spanish was, I would say, primitive, because I didn't have enough experience to have noticed enough limitations in my approach and then improved on that method as to eliminate limitations. Now, 4 years later, I've sort of noticed lots of limitations and I've improved on my method, but I'm still constantly looking for and finding limitations, and then I'm trying to figure out how to fill those gaps, how to improve my model. So that's basically what you want to do. So an example from language learning, for example, so my method learning Spanish was very basic, and basically what I did was I had a flashcard deck. I think it was the 5,000 most common Spanish words, and so flashcards. So on the front I had the Spanish word out of context, and then I had English on the backside out of context, and then vice versa. And so this kind of worked. The thing is about language learning, for example, is that many methods work, but they will be more or less efficient or more or less effective, more or less enjoyable, basically. So even if your method has lots of limitations, it might still work, right? Especially if the language is quite easy to learn in relation to your native language, which Spanish was an ideal like first language, because you have room for sort of limitations in your method, right? So over time I noticed a few limitations with this approach. For example, so I did flashcards, and then I did speaking practice with people, basically, and then I did that for a year or so. And that kind of worked, right? But over time I started to notice limitations. For example, my listening comprehension was lacking, for example. Then, okay, why is my listening comprehension lacking? Well, probably because I'm not listening enough, right? So basically I got all my listening just from speaking lessons, for example. And so in a speaking lesson, you might speak 50% of the time or something like that, and then the other person is speaking 50% of the time. And if you're using a language partner, then you will be practicing their target language for half of the time. So the amount of input you can get from language, like those types of lessons, is going to be limited, right? So I noticed a limitation there. Okay, but if I just listen to, it's super obvious, right? So dumb for not realizing this, but like, why don't I just listen to stuff in my target language and as to improve my listening comprehension, right? It's like so obvious, right? So that was a basic limitation. Another limitation that it took me a while to notice, because I was starting with scratch, I didn't know anything about language learning, was that it doesn't really make sense to learn words out of context, for example. And that took me a while to realize. I had to study psychology and stuff like that. because our brain is very good at using context to learn things. It's really good at inferring information. So let's say you have a sentence, you know all the words except one word. So if you have enough context, your brain is going to be able to guess or infer the meaning of that word, depending on the context, right? And so if you're learning words out of context, you're making it unnecessarily difficult for your brain to learn the meaning of that word. You're not using you're sort of not leveraging the capacities that your brain has, which is being able to infer information very, very well. Right, so that's a limitation. And as I learned Spanish and I learned more and more languages, I noticed more and more limitations in my approach and try to find methods as to fill the gaps. So this is basically something, because if you're not looking for limitations, then you might be stuck in the first iteration of your model, right? Back when I did these out of context flashcards, I did just speaking practice and flashcards, and that was all I did. If I never looked for limitation, if I consciously wasn't trying to improve my method, I would be stuck there. And my progress that I've been able to achieve in these last 4 years would have been much less, because my method would simply have been more efficient, less effective, and arguably less enjoyable as well. Because understanding the learning process also enables you to understand what makes the process more enjoyable. Because to learn something, you need to spend the time. To spend the time, to some extent, the process needs to be compelling, enjoyable, interesting, easy enough, not too hard, basically. So, yeah, it's a bit of a long-winded explanation, but yeah, look for limitations in your approach. Don't just try to confirm what you already think, because unless you've been engaging in that learning process for a really long time, it is unlikely that you've noticed every possible limitation. Even I think of myself as an advanced language learner, more or less, but I'm still acutely aware of the limitations in my approach, where I haven't really sort of filled the gap. So you want to imagine that you're your own little science community, right? And normally in science, you have other people trying to disconfirm your theories and your beliefs all the time. In language learning, since it's your own project, you don't really have those people. So you need to train yourself to do it yourself. So you want to be your own little science community, developing theories, looking for limitations, testing things, testing hypotheses. Okay, so that was all for this video. I guess a bit chaotic, a bit long-winded today, but anyway, so see you in the next video. Leave a comment down below if you have any ideas yourself. I'd love to discuss ideas. I love discussing ideas or whatever. Okay, catch you in the next video.